There is a man the world believes it knows. A man whose voice alone can stop a room, low and deliberate, coiling through the air like smoke from a fire that has burned for a very long time. You have watched him on screen. You have probably quoted him without even realizing it. You have seen him accept awards with that half smile that reveals nothing, that calm behind the eyes that makes you wonder what, exactly, is living behind them. But here is what nobody asked. Here is what nobody thought to look for. What does it cost a man to become the greatest actor alive, and still not know, not truly know, whether the people he loved most ever forgave him? What happens to a boy from a gray industrial town in Wales who spent the first 2 decades of his life being told, quietly and consistently, that he was slow, that he was wrong, that he would amount to nothing, and who carried that wound so deep inside him that even decades of applause and 2 Oscar statues and a knighthood from the Queen could not fully close it? And what did he choose, deliberately, stubbornly, at the cost of almost everything, to keep hidden from the world, while the world was busy celebrating him? This is not the story you think you know. This is the other one. The one that starts in the smoke and steel of Port Talbot, Wales, where the sky was always the color of cold ash and the river smelled of iron, and where a quiet, strange little boy sat alone at a piano because he simply did not know how else to exist in the world. That boy became Sir Anthony Hopkins. But what it took to get there, and what it cost to stay there, that is something else entirely. Port Talbot in the 1940s was not a gentle place to grow up. It was a town built on muscle and heat, on the furnace glow of the steelworks that painted the night sky orange for miles in every direction. Richard Arthur Hopkins, Anthony's father, was a baker, a working man with flour on his hands before dawn and exhaustion in his shoulders by noon. A decent man, a disciplined man, but not an easy one to reach. Anthony would later say that whenever he was tempted to think too highly of himself, he thought of his father's hands, the hardened, cracked, broken hands of a man who built a life through sheer physical labor and asked no one for admiration. Anthony Philip Hopkins was born on the last day of 1937, on New Year's Eve, as if he'd arrived already late for one world and impatient for the next. He was a solitary child almost from the beginning, not sullen, but unreachable in the way that certain children are, as if they're listening to a frequency that no one else can pick up. He preferred to draw rather than to run. He preferred the piano to conversation. He preferred to sit alone in a room and make something rather than go outside and belong to the rough democracy of the schoolyard, where belonging required a kind of ease he simply did not possess. There was a reason for that, though nobody had the language for it yet. His dyslexia was severe enough that sitting in a classroom was a particular kind of daily torture. The words on the page swam and slipped. His teachers, in the way of that era, had no patience for a child who seemed to refuse to learn. They called it laziness. They called it stubbornness. They marked him as trouble, as limited, as someone who would cap out early. He sat at the bottom of the class and absorbed the verdict like a stone absorbs cold water, all the way through. I was a poor learner, he would say decades later, which left me open to ridicule and gave me an inferiority complex. He was not being self-deprecating when he said that. He was stating, with the precision of a man who has spent 88 years studying a wound, exactly what happened to him. What saved him, the only thing that saved him, was beauty. The beauty of a chord struck just right on a piano. The beauty of a brushstroke that captured something true about the light on the hills above Port Talbot. The beauty of a story told so well that it pulled you somewhere else entirely. He found these things on his own. No teacher pointed him toward them. His mother, Muriel, quiet and steady, gave him space. His father gave him the example of someone who showed up every single day. But the art, that was Anthony alone, pressing his hands into the only world where he did not feel wrong. Then, when he was 15 years old, something happened that changed the molecular structure of his ambitions. He knocked on a door. The door belonged to Richard Burton. The Richard Burton, the working-class Welsh boy who had detonated out of poverty and charm and an almost supernatural voice into the dazzling and dangerous orbit of Hollywood. Burton was already famous, already luminous, already the kind of man who filled whatever room he entered to the point of overflow. He lived near Hopkins in the geography of their shared Welsh world, and to the 15-year-old Anthony, he was something almost beyond imagining. A proof that the world outside Port Talbot existed. A proof that someone like them, someone from here, from this gray industrial coast, could actually, physically go and become something enormous. Hopkins knocked on Burton's door to ask for an autograph, and Burton, midway through shaving, answered it. He was gracious. He was kind. He signed whatever the boy had brought. It was a brief, ordinary interaction. And yet the 15-year-old Anthony Hopkins walked home from that door a different person. Because what he had seen in Richard Burton's green eyes, that stare, that calm, that radiant certainty of self, was a mirror he had never known existed. I wanted to become somebody like that, Hopkins said later. I just didn't want to be what I was. That is the sentence that unlocks everything. Not ambition in the ordinary sense. Not the desire for fame or money or the sweet machinery of success. It was something rawer and more urgent than that. He wanted to stop being what he was, the boy at the bottom of the class, the one who couldn't read properly, the one who sat alone at the piano while the others ran and shouted and belonged. He wanted to become someone else. And if Richard Burton had done it, if this son of a Welsh coal miner had done it by pure will and talent and the sheer defiant music of his voice, then maybe, Anthony Hopkins could too. He enrolled at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama in Cardiff. And everything that had seemed like a defect, the obsessiveness, the way his mind locked onto a single thing and refused to let go, the hours he could spend alone repeating the same phrase until it became perfect, suddenly became the foundation of a vocation. He graduated in 1957. He served 2 years in the British Army. Then he went to London, to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and trained with everything he had. And the world began, slowly, to bend toward him. Laurence Olivier noticed him. Laurence Olivier, the greatest classical actor in the English-speaking world, the man who had made Shakespeare feel like oxygen, saw what Anthony Hopkins was and invited him to join the Royal National Theatre. Olivier wrote in his own memoir that this young actor had taken a role and walked away with it, like a cat with a mouse between its teeth. Imagine being 27 years old and having Laurence Olivier say that about you. Imagine what that feels like after a childhood of being told you couldn't learn, couldn't keep up, didn't belong. He was on his way. But something else was happening too. Something quiet and invisible and gathering. The theater drank. That was simply how it worked in those years. After performances, after rehearsals, in the dressing rooms and the nearby pubs, and the long dark corridors between who you were on stage and who you were supposed to be when the lights came down, there was always a drink waiting. And for Anthony Hopkins, that drink was not like it was for other people. For other people, a drink was a social lubricant, a way to unwind, a pleasure. For him, it was something else, something chemical and total, something that filled the hollow places. It was like being possessed by a demon, an addiction, he would later say. And I couldn't stop. Millions of people are like that. I could not stop. He married his first wife, Petronella Barker, a fellow actress, in 1966. They had a daughter, Abigail, born in 1968. And in that small apartment somewhere in Britain, with a baby daughter and a young wife and a career that was building towards something genuinely significant, Anthony Hopkins was also quietly, methodically, dismantling his own life. He drank in the morning and at night. He drank before performances and after. He was skilled enough at managing it, switching bottles in the cabinet, calibrating the intake so the slurring didn't show, keeping just enough control to function, that it was almost invisible from the outside. Almost. But his marriage was not invisible. His marriage was what it is when one person is fighting a private war that the other person can see but not name. Tense. Frightened. Already ending even while it appeared to be continuing. Then came the night he left. There had been an argument. There were always arguments in those days. And after this one, Anthony Hopkins walked down the hall to where Abigail lay asleep in her crib, 14 months old, entirely unknowing, breathing the small, sweet breaths of a child who has no concept yet that the world can simply walk away. He looked down at her. He whispered goodbye. Then he picked up his suitcases in the hallway and walked out the door. That image, that crib, that sleeping child, that whispered word, is the wound at the center of this story. Everything else in Anthony Hopkins' life radiates outward from that moment. All the greatness that came after, all the healing, all the philosophy about letting go of the past and living in the present. It all begins there, in a hallway, with a man choosing to leave and a baby too young to understand what leaving means. He has spent the decades since trying to explain it, sometimes with honesty, sometimes with deflection, sometimes with the kind of philosophical equanimity that sounds almost like peace but contains, if you listen carefully, the specific frequency of a man who has never entirely forgiven himself. "It is the saddest fact of my life," he wrote in his 2025 memoir, "and my greatest regret, and yet I feel absolutely sure that it would have been much worse for everyone if I had stayed." Maybe that is true. Maybe staying, drunk and unreachable and at war with himself, would have done more damage than leaving. But Abigail grew up with a father who was somewhere else. And that is not a philosophical abstraction. That is a girl's life. And it is the thing that no amount of Oscar speeches or knighthoods or standing ovations can fully address. By 1975, it was becoming clear that something had to break. Anthony Hopkins was 37 years old. He was working, television, film, stage, but the work felt increasingly like something happening to someone else, someone he was watching from a slight distance through a haze of vodka and self-loathing. He had remarried. He was building another life on top of the rubble of the first. And still the drinking continued, quiet and relentless as a tide. Then came December 29, 1975, a night that he has described many times, in many interviews, with a vividness that never fades. He was driving in California. He was drunk, in a blackout, he says, with no clear memory of how he had gotten into the car or where he was going. The streets of whatever California suburb he was moving through were dark and ordinary and completely indifferent to the fact that a man was behind the wheel of a machine he was not capable of controlling. And somewhere in the blur of that drive, something cracked open inside him. "I realized I could have killed somebody," he said later, "or myself, which I didn't care about, but I could have killed a family." He stopped. He found his way to a party in Beverly Hills. He found an ex-agent and said the 4 words that it had taken him 37 years to say, "I need help now." He made a phone call to an AA intergroup in Los Angeles. They offered to send someone to him. He said, "No, I'll come to you." And he drove, carefully this time, to his first meeting. And in that meeting, in a room with folding chairs and weak coffee and the specific, irreducible dignity of people who have come to the end of their pretending, something happened to Anthony Hopkins that he has never been fully able to explain and has never stopped trying to describe. A woman at the meeting turned to him. He was an atheist, had been for years. Faith had always seemed to him like a crutch for people who couldn't face the machine indifference of the universe. And this woman, whose name he does not remember, asked him a question so simple it was almost absurd. "Why don't you just trust in God?" He thought about it. He was desperate. He had run completely out of alternatives. He thought, why not? And he said yes. "I could not stop," he said years later. "But I just asked for a little bit of help." And suddenly, pow! It was just like bingo. The craving left him that night. He has never had another drink. That was December 29th, 1975. He has now been sober for 50 years. What happened inside Anthony Hopkins after that night is something that happened slowly, in the dark, like roots finding water deep underground. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a fanfare. It just begins, the quiet work of rebuilding a self that has been systematically demolished. The mornings that were no longer contaminated by shame. The clarity that crept back in, tentative at first, like light through a window that has been painted over. The discovery that he could feel things, real things, not numb things, and that the feeling, even when it was painful, was infinitely preferable to the nothing of the bottle. His career continued. The work kept coming. Television, film, stage. In 1980, he appeared in The Elephant Man alongside John Hurt, and the critical world took notice of something in him that was not merely technical. A depth, a stillness, a quality of absolute presence that the camera simply could not look away from. The years of isolation and obsessive preparation and that relentless Welsh stubbornness had produced something that could not be manufactured, an actor who was entirely, terrifyingly real. But the real moment, the moment that changed everything not just for Anthony Hopkins, but for cinema itself, was still coming. And when it came in the form of a script with a title that initially struck Hopkins as the name of a children's book, The Silence of the Lambs. He read it on a plane. By the end, his hands were steady and his mind was already building the character. Hannibal Lecter, a brilliant psychiatrist, a monster, a man of exquisite taste and complete absence of moral constraint. Hopkins spent months constructing him from the inside out. He read the script 250 times. He shaped the voice, that careful, measured, silken cadence, from a combination of influences, the cadence of Katharine Hepburn, the stillness of a cobra, something that was neither British nor American but entirely its own geography. He made Lecter not blink. Not because he was told to, but because he understood that the most terrifying quality a predator can have is perfect stillness. The most dangerous thing in any room is the thing that doesn't move. The film was released in 1991. Anthony Hopkins was in it for 16 minutes. 16 minutes of screen time. And those 16 minutes became the most discussed performance in a generation. The AFI named Hannibal Lecter the #1 villain in the history of American cinema. At the 1992 Academy Awards, Anthony Hopkins won the Oscar for Best Actor. He was 53 years old. He stood at the microphone at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion and said thank you, and the audience gave him a standing ovation. And somewhere in that enormous room filled with the golden light of Hollywood, a boy from Port Talbot, who had been told he was slow and limited and not worth much, was receiving the highest honor his profession could give. The Oscar statue was real. The applause was real. And behind his quiet, characteristic smile, that half smile that reveals nothing, something real was happening that no one in the room could see. He went home and put the Oscar on the sideboard near his television. He didn't move it for years. Once, when asked about it, he said, "Now all it does is sit there and rot away. I don't think you should take things like that too seriously. We are all going to die eventually." That is not false modesty. That is a man who has learned, through the hardest possible curriculum, to distinguish between what matters and what only seems to. But the story was not finished with its surprises. Because even as the accolades piled up, the BAFTA Fellowship, the knighthood from Queen Elizabeth in 1993, the Hollywood Walk of Fame star, a second Oscar in 2021 for The Father when he became the oldest Best Actor winner in history at 83. Even as all of this accumulated, there were things that Anthony Hopkins carried that the spotlight never quite reached. His daughter Abigail grew up in England without him. They reconnected briefly in the 1990s. She appeared in 2 of his films, Shadowlands and The Remains of the Day, and they walked a red carpet together once. And for a moment, it seemed as though the gulf might close. But by 2001, they were estranged again, and this time it held. Abigail would say in 2006 that she had never felt close to her father, that their relationship had always been sporadic, that she saw him maybe once a year, and that there was a little bit of sadness, a phrase that contains, In its quiet understatement, an ocean of loss. Hopkins has spoken about it with a candor that has sometimes bordered on brutal. In 2018, he admitted he didn't know if Abigail had children. He didn't know what she was doing or where she was living beyond somewhere in England. And when pressed on how he felt about that, he said, "I don't care one way or the other." He was challenged. He admitted it was cold. "Well," he said, "it is cold." His wife Stella, whom he married in 2003 and who has been the third and apparently final marriage, sent an invitation to Abigail to come and visit. No response came. Hopkins shrugged in that way he has. Not the shrug of indifference, but the shrug of a man who has decided that certain doors can only be knocked on so many times before the knocking becomes its own kind of damage. "I wish her well," he said, "but I'm not going to waste blood over that. If you want to waste your life being in resentment, fine, go ahead. That's death. You're not living." What is extraordinary about those words is that they contain, if you turn them just slightly, a self-portrait. Because Anthony Hopkins knows something about resentment from the inside. He spent years in the grip of a substance that was itself a form of resentment. Resentment toward feeling, toward connection, toward the discomfort of being fully present in a life. He drank to get away from himself. And he stopped, at 37, by choosing, in desperation and grace and something he can only describe as divine, to stop running. The piano had been with him all along. The piano from those Port Talbot days, the instrument that had saved him when the classroom wanted to discard him, was still there. He composed music throughout his life, a waltz he wrote in 1964 called, "And the Waltz Goes On," that he kept in a drawer for 46 years before his wife contacted the Dutch conductor André Rieu, who performed it to a standing ovation in 2010. He sat in the audience and wept. He released a full album of classical compositions in 2012. He painted. He composed. He continued, with the same obsessive, unstoppable energy that his autism spectrum diagnosis eventually helped explain, though he himself dismissed the label with characteristic impatience. ADHD, OCD, Asperger's. Oh God. It's called living. In November 2025, at 88 years old, he published his memoir. He called it "We Did Okay, Kid." The title is addressed, there is no question about this, to himself, to the boy in Port Talbot, to the child at the bottom of the class, to the man who walked out of a hallway, leaving a sleeping baby behind. He is telling that boy, we did okay. Not perfectly, not without damage, not without the suitcases and the crib and the whispered goodbye, but okay. The faith that began in that AA meeting in 1975 did not remain simple. Hopkins has described it as something that grows and changes, something he cannot reduce to a denomination or a creed. He is not a man of church buildings or Sunday rituals. His is a faith of moments, the specific moment when a craving vanished like smoke, the moment of grace that arrived when he had run out of every other option. He once described life without faith as living in a closed cell with no windows. Whether or not you share his belief, what is unmistakable is the practical function of that faith in his life. It stopped him from dying. Because that is not an exaggeration. By the winter of 1975, Anthony Hopkins was on a trajectory that ends in one of two places, a hospital bed or a grave. The drinking had gone beyond pleasure or ritual or social habit into something that was consuming him from the inside. He knew it. He said, remembering those last months of drinking, I was thinking, this is going to kill me. And he was right. It would have. The fact that he is here at 88, painting, composing, acting, writing memoirs, hosting galas with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra in Riyadh, is itself a miracle of the most ordinary kind. The miracle of a man who, at the very last moment, chose to stop and ask for help and received it from a direction he had never considered looking. He still practices gratitude as a discipline. He still goes through his work with a ferocity that younger actors find alarming, memorizing scripts hundreds of times, building characters from the molecular level up, approaching every role as if it is the only one he will ever have. The Asperger's obsessiveness that tormented his schoolteachers became the instrument of his art. What they called a problem, he made into a method. His father's hands, those hardened, broken, flour-covered hands, are still in him. Whenever he feels the temptation to think himself special, he goes back to them. The baker's hands. The hands of a man who never asked for anyone's admiration and never received a standing ovation, and woke up before dawn every single day of his working life, because that was simply what you did. Those hands are the anchor line. They are what keeps Anthony Hopkins from floating away into the rarefied air of Hollywood self-importance. They are his ground. He has been asked, many times, what he wishes he had done differently. The daughter question comes up. The marriages, 3 of them, the first 2 ending in the specific damage of a man who is not yet capable of being present. He answers with the philosophy he has earned rather than the one he was given. The past is sealed, he told the Sunday Times. I have regrets. You can't undo things. He is right. You cannot. And the particular tragedy of Anthony Hopkins is that the very qualities that made him one of the greatest actors who ever lived, the obsessiveness, the isolation, the inability to fully inhabit ordinary human connection, the tendency to disappear into a role or into a bottle with equal totality, are the same qualities that cost him his first family and fractured the most fundamental relationship a person can have, the one between a father and a child. Abigail Hopkins is 57 years old. She is an actress and a filmmaker. She has, according to her Instagram account, dealt with a stage 3 bowel cancer diagnosis. She is living her life, somewhere in England, carrying the particular weight of being the daughter of someone the whole world admires, and having never quite felt that admiration was meant. There is no clean ending to that story. There is no redemption arc that ties it together neatly. There is only a man at 88 years old, writing a memoir with a title that sounds like both an apology and a blessing. We did okay, kid, and hoping that somewhere across the ocean, the child he whispered goodbye to in a darkened hallway might one day open those pages and find something she can use. He will not stop working. He cannot. The work is the only prayer he completely trusts. Last year, he hosted a concert in Riyadh featuring his own compositions, performed by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, and sat in his chair in the audience and listened to the music that had begun 60 years ago as something he kept locked in a drawer. A waltz called And the Waltz Goes On. The title now sounds less like a description and more like a vow. And now I want to speak to you, not to Anthony Hopkins, not to the legend or the legacy or the academic analysis of a career. To you, sitting wherever you are sitting right now, watching this and carrying whatever it is you are carrying. Because here is what I think you heard in this story, even if you haven't quite named it yet. You heard that a person can be simultaneously extraordinary and incomplete. You heard that success does not equal healing. You heard that the thing you most want to escape, the quiet, terrible thing at the center of yourself, the reason you reach for whatever it is you reach for when the lights go down and the performance is over, that thing will wait. It will wait with perfect patience until you are ready to look at it. Anthony Hopkins looked at it on December 29, 1975, on a dark road in California, driving drunk to nowhere, and he made a choice. Not a heroic choice, not a cinematic choice, a desperate one. The kind of choice that can only be made when you have run completely out of other options. He said yes to help. He said yes to something larger than his own willfulness. And it saved him. He is not a saint. The sleeping baby in the crib, the whispered goodbye, the suitcases in the hallway, that happened. He has never pretended otherwise. His daughter is still out there, still carrying what she carries. The past is sealed, as he says. You cannot go back. You can only go forward with the truth of it, the full weight of it, without looking away and without letting it kill you. There is a piano in this story. There has always been a piano, the instrument that saved a dyslexic boy in Port Talbot when nothing else could reach him, the The music that came out of him for decades while the whole world was watching his face and wondering about Hannibal Lecter's eyes. The piano was there when the classroom rejected him. The piano was there when the bottle nearly took him. The piano is there now, at 88, still making music, still the private language of a man who learned very early that beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity. What is your piano? What is the thing that stays with you? The thing that was there before the world told you what you were supposed to be and will still be there after the world stops watching. Because that thing, whatever it is where you actually live. Everything else is performance. Anthony Hopkins at 88 is a man who has lost things he can never recover, built things that will outlast him, and somehow, in the space between those two facts, found a way to be grateful. Not uncomplicated gratitude. Not the gratitude of someone who got everything they wanted. The gratitude of someone who almost died, who walked away from people he loved, who spent decades running from himself, and who found, in the rubble of all of that he was still standing and the music was still playing. The waltz goes on. Does yours?